Can everybody hear me now?
Yep, we can hear you.
That's great. All right. Look, thanks, Steve. Thanks to Georgina and all the team at EGR for putting this together and for getting us all organised. It's not the easiest thing to do when we're spread across countries and time zones. Now all we have to do is hope that the tech holds up. Specific thanks to the panel for agreeing to take part, because like most of us attending this webinar, we all have our part to play in the viability and sustainability of the organisations we work for and the sector as a whole. So a big thanks to everyone who's joined us for today, and I hope you find the content and the debate valuable. We do value your input, and you've said at the start, so any questions then please fire them over and we'll try to answer them either at the end or maybe as we're going along when it's relevant. Before we kick off, just a quick apologies on behalf of Kira. That's Kira Mendelson, who's been unable to make it today. She's UK Compliance Director for Consumer and has unfortunately been called away at the last minute, and I guess that's perks of having a job in compliance. So she sends her apologies. So however, those that remain can give a great view of the subject matter and the issues around it. So let me first introduce you to the members of the panel. That's the panel that's taking place today, but we'll go one by one. So if you could just introduce yourselves, your organisations, who you work for, and where you fit into the gambling ecosystem. And we'll start first with Peter-Paul.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks EGR and Onfido for making this webinar possible. I am the MD of the Dutch Online Trade Association Speelverantwoord. Before this, I was an MD of a lottery operator in the Netherlands called Lottoveet, so I have some operational experience as an operator as well. Before that, I have 15 years experience as an executive in IT and mobile telecommunications in Europe, the Americas, the Caribbean, and in the South Pacific region.
That's great. Thanks for that, Peter-Paul. James, over to yourself.
Thanks, Peter. Good afternoon, everyone. So yes, James Baston-Pitt. I'm the UK accounts lead. I work at Onfido, which is a global identity verification solution. I've had been fortunate to join as the 20th joiner and now seen it to grow to nearly 300. And the role here has been working with a variety of businesses online to support them with verifying their customers. So basically giving them the ability to know their customers are who they claim to be.
Great, thanks for that, James. Right, over to Trent.
Hi everyone, my name is Trent Wyatt. I am a consultant with GeoComply. Prior to GeoComply, I was in the iGaming industry, specifically with the Stars Group for a period of 12 years. During that time, I was security product manager, and now at GeoComply, I am assisting them with ensuring that they have compliance grade products for their location services and our future of expanding into additional compliance verticals. GeoComply is a global leader in geolocation technology. They launched in 2011, and they've quickly become an industry trusted solution for reliable, secure, and accurate geolocation services. We currently support regulated online casino, poker, sports betting, lottery, advanced deposit wagering, and daily fantasy sports operators in 44 US states. And our goal is to ensure compliance with state and federal regulations.
That's great. Thanks for that, Trent. We'll come back to that. So anybody who doesn't know me or haven't come across me, I head up, I'm a director for Alexem Services, which is a small consultancy dealing with data and technology. That picture there is clearly who I'd like to be. Unfortunately, it's not. And unfortunately, I look like that. So having said that, my purpose today is to make sure that the conversation keeps flowing. We get to all the salient and relevant points. And what we'll do is we'll kick off. So I think, thanks to the panelists, but I think there's no doubt that the single biggest issue in the industry today affecting us all is probably regulation in its various forms. It's the cost, it's the complexity, and the confusion as to what is expected and what's mandatory. So in this webinar, we want to explore both the current landscape, the challenges we have to meet, and what practically we can sort of do to meet the obligations. Central to that, though, is getting a true and complete picture of the industry's most valuable asset, and that's the customer. it seems that all the component parts of the sector lead eventually back to that, and the ability to identify and engage on a one-to-one, direct and bespoke level is business critical across all aspects of any company. And we look at the eye-watering fines that have been meted out recently, and I think it's heading up towards nearly £30 million in the UK alone. Then this is becoming the new norm. Fines focus minds, as they say. And for those attending today who may not have a UK focus and who may think this approach is for others, then beware, because the Gambling Commission in the UK seems to be increasingly viewed as a sort of a blueprint for others. And indeed, I think it's Tim Miller of the Commission. He stated he's keen to expand his engagement with other regulators and is about to embark on a tour of other jurisdictions to share best practice. Therefore, we have to work on the basis that regulators bearing their teeth in a similar fashion to the new UK as the new norm. And in fact, actually, if history tells us anything, then expect there to be a competitive edge to fines and revoking of licenses as regulators vie to toughen up on an industry in the eye of a political, public and media storm. But today we wanted to explore what this means for the industry and what we can do about de-risking the sector, not just from an operator level, but across the entire stakeholder ecosystem. So we hope the panel covers that with a cross-section that takes in both the suppliers and vendors view from James, looking at the data and technology, collaborations and how we add value to the ID process. I'm really pleased that we can add the US perspective with Trent because they have, I think, 100% of the geolocation market, but are evolving what they've got to beef up the identity view. And then probably the most timely part of that is going to be the soon-to-be regulated market of the Netherlands. So what we want to do is just approach it over forward to keep us on track and under time, because I tend to be able to waffle on for these things for a while. So we're going to look at it from four main perspectives. Regulation, what it means and where it's going. KYC and how that's changing and how that's important to the trust and sustainability of this sector. The innovation we are seeing and what that looks like and what's coming in to help support both the operators and the regulators. And then we're going to look at the consumers, what they are expecting, what they're demanding, and how sort of user experience will play a big part in meeting all of the compliance needs. But let's kick off with the rock stars of the sector, those high profile sort of headline grabbing up front and center. Look at me, bodies that we all want to be friends with. It's the regulators setting the agenda, and it's not just the UK. As I mentioned earlier, Sweden and Holland are baring their teeth with fines and license withdrawals. Holland even before it launches its new regime. So I'll come to the panel and go, what do we think of this sort of new laser-like focus, and where do we think the real pay points are? And first I'll come to Peter-Paul on that one. So if you tell us the view on regulation around the Dutch market at the moment.
Yeah, so it's quite right what you said, that the Dutch regulator is getting tough before the market is opening. Although it has to be said that the market was going to be opened, back in 2015, if I'm not mistaken. So we've been awaiting that for a long period now, and there seems to be more delay down the line. But even while the regulation of the market, of the online market, is being delayed, the regulator is forced to really slam down on things like underage gambling. And it turned out that, for instance, at the end of August, that it was, as they called it, childishly easy for children to play on online websites. So with that news breaking, the minister was forced to come out really strictly and ordered the KSA to ensure that it would become impossible for underage Dutch consumers to participate in online gambling, and this is ahead of any company being able to get a license for online gambling.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting watching the new regulatory regimes come in. I was with the Sweden and the Norwegian trade associations last week at the Sigma event, and they're at varying different journeys along their path. But I think that's such a big focus is the Dutch one, and especially with that news around the underages being able to get on, and we'll come to the whole KYC aspect in a minute. Before we come on to the US, Peter-Paul, how do you think the regulators, I won't ask him to give a mark out of 10, but how do you think they're doing at the moment? Where do you think they are in that process?
To be fair, I think they're doing a great job, considering that they are limited in what they can do legally. A lot of what they are able to do under the new bill, as soon as the bill comes into force, because it still has not been signed into force by the king. But as soon as the bill comes into force, they get a lot of legal powers. For instance, to go after rogue operators. And to enforce fines across the border and all that sort of thing. So, given the circumstances that they are in, with a limited, let's say, toolkit of measures that they can take, they are, I think they're doing the best they can, and they're in a how do you say that, between a rock and a hard place, I would say, because. According to many members of parliament in the Netherlands, they are not doing enough and they are not being strict enough. According to many operators, they are being overly strict. I think.
So I was just going to say, it's fascinating when politics gets involved, because we're having the same thing in the UK with the upcoming election, and all the parties have taken a view which. You can say one thing before you get into power and then another maybe afterwards, but they're all wanting to take a more strict view on the sector and come up with new regulations. So I guess where the UK is approaching that slightly from a different angle. Trent, if I come to you, because I guess one of the biggest focuses for the sector, certainly the bigger brands that are out there and where growth's coming from, is obviously the area you're experienced in around the US. So what's the latest we're seeing in from a regulatory perspective over there?
Yeah, the regulation's not that dissimilar from the UK, and in fact, the US regulators have utilized that as a footprint for what they're going to do. However, within the USA, each state is different, and they have different level of regulations that they're requiring, dependent on, as you said, the political influence that may have occurred, the thought process behind what's safer and what's least restrictive. For example, Nevada has online sports betting, but in order to do so, you must live register at the casinos. They feel that having the person physically present with their government issued ID is the level of know your customer requirement to ensure that the account owner is who they say they are. Then you have other states that are taking a little different approach. Mississippi, for example, only allows on-property sports betting and on-property registration. And then you have other states like Iowa that have recently come in, where they're doing a live in-person registration process for the first 18 months, and then they are going to go to a mobile registration process. Then you have, the leader as far as the newcomer and the new starter in New Jersey, where they have full online mobile registration, and that is done through data verification. And as the market matures and more states are coming on, the regulators are talking to each other, and they're helping and working together to determine what is the best approach, whether it be a live registration or a mobile registration. And as the tools become more robust, their comfort level is increasing in regards to mobile registration. But it's still not quite there yet and needs to be a little bit more mature before that happens. It's going to be a continual growth of state-by-state regulations, but being that the United States all falls under federal law, they will adhere to most of the requirements of federal law dependent on how the state approach is.
Yeah, I think it's very similar to the sort of 28 states across Europe, I guess, that everybody's different. And I think you mentioned there that you're all talking to each other. Collaboration seems to be a big issue, but everybody seems to potentially be trying to reinvent the wheel. And back to my point earlier about they may take some aspects but try and toughen up on others. And I guess that's the challenge from an operator's perspective. And that's why compliance is so costly and complex when they're trying to pull all those bits together. And it's probably one of the big drivers around the whole mergers and acquisitions going on at the moment. James, if I could come to you from a UK perspective and what you're seeing, because they're the ones that are handing out the sort of eye-watering fines. What's your view on the UK, and how do you think their approach is at the moment?
Yes, so I mean, ultimately, the UK itself is still one of the biggest online markets, and I guess the compliance approach and the regulatory approach probably puts most scrutiny to the UK because it's the biggest area of risk due to the severe or the significant volume of customers and players that are active. Now as we know, regulation for many years has written within it around, I guess, key elements when it comes to identity or KYC. And really, the underpinning of this has been CRA data, so credit reference agency data, using that to verify a customer. And it wasn't until recent years have the quite strict framework there been relaxed to businesses to adopt a risk-based approach. And that has had an impact across many changes that regulators have allowed across financial services, healthcare, and what we're probably going to see soon will be the gaming vertical as well, so all of the operators. And that's primarily because the CRA method has been the primary method to verify new players, and it wasn't until recently where this approach, I guess, is starting to be scrutinized quite significantly. To have a little look. Sorry, after you, Peter. I was just going to.
No, sorry. I was going to say it. Yeah, sorry. I was going to say absolutely, and I think we'll come to that. What underpins the KYC in a second, and I think it's just interesting how all the different regulators are doing it. Just from a sort of technology perspective, James, do you think? And I'll come back to Peter, Paul, and Trent on exactly the same questions. Do you think they get it? Do you think they understand the technology or are doing enough to understand it? And if they are, great. If not, what do we need to do to help them out there?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think regulators look closely on the flagship providers, those operators who are trying to operate with the greatest level of integrity and trust. And ultimately, they want to ensure that they have the right balance of ensuring the market, their industry continues to grow, but grow in a reliant way, in a way which they can trust. Now, I think what we found is that in other verticals outside of this, many other operators have tried new things when it comes to KYC onboarding, which has then made it far easier for regulation to come in, good regulation in terms of creating better, tighter standards to protect players, to protect the industry. And at the moment, I think there's a little bit of a chicken and an egg scenario whereby the regulators are looking for guidance on what good looks like, how can we make it better? And I think the operators are also doing the same back to the regulator, also for that guidance. So it seems to be, they used to be the leaders, this space in the online, especially the online world, but now it seems like it's kind of stuck in limbo. It has been for quite a few years.
Well, I think it's interesting what we can, particularly interested to get into a little bit later, on what we can learn from other sectors, because when, as you say, when banks and financial institutions seems to have taken a bit of a lead on us, that simply can't be right. But if I come back to Trent, just on because you guys are pretty high profile at Senate hearings, etc. Do you think regulators sort of get the tech, or where are they in that process, and what can we do to help them understand how it can support their challenges?
Yeah, I think most of the regulators have an understanding of the tech, but there's not as much trust in the tech at this point. For example, like I said, with Mississippi only allowing on property sports betting. They feel better in control of it. So they're still hesitant to trust the tech out there. But then other regulators are a little more forward thinking, like New Jersey or Indiana, where it's full online mobile registration. They do understand the tech. They still are hesitant to improve or innovate in that space until they're comfortable. If we look at like the historical of how biometrics and things of that have happened, some of the original phones that had fingerprint scanning or Face ID scanning weren't very accurate. They could be spoofed easily. So those were concerns that the regulators have. So I feel like a lot of the regulations are being driven by what the regulators think at that time for what the tech can provide. And as the market matures, I think their comfort level is growing. And companies like ours, where we're providing that high level compliance, auditability, and the working with the regulators to improve upon those regulations, they are becoming more comfortable with the tech, and things that'll be available today will have to improve tomorrow in order to have more of consistency across the variety of markets, whether it be within just the United States or even at a global level. Each of the regulators are going to take the best practices that are learned from each other and apply those within their respective regions.
Yeah, I think it is about building up trust, but I think there's an onus on sort of vendors and tech companies here to make sure that they're out in front of them, demonstrating what's happening elsewhere and how it actually works, because I think that then will add to that confidence level. Peter-Paul, from a Dutch perspective, you were saying they were doing the best they can a little earlier. Do we feel, from a understanding the tech perspective, they're on the front foot?
Yeah, it sounds all very familiar, I must say. The Netherlands isn't that different from what I hear from the States and the UK. The Netherlands as a whole, or the Dutch ID verification and age verification industry, or where we're at the moment, I think is slightly lagging behind. If you compare, for instance, to markets like Sweden and Norway, where you have bank ID, there is absolutely not an issue as an operator to get a turnkey and very trusted solution in place. In the Netherlands, there currently is a provider called IDIN. It's run by the Dutch banks, but that wasn't fully available to operators that wanted KYC, good KYC at the front door. So the regulator, so the technical knowledge of the regulator is I would say sufficient. They have some really smart people there, but we have some big steps to take as a whole, and that includes the regulator.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, we're all being nice to regulators. We'll take that for today. So, but what that does really need us nicely into is sort of a next section around KYC, and we'll stick with you, Peter-Paul, because I think the interesting news, as you've mentioned a couple of weeks ago, around what happened with underage people being able to get onto the current one. For me, KYC, James mentioned earlier, has moved on. It's about real-time understanding. It's much more dynamic with different layers. So just give us a brief overview of what system, because I think the regulators demanded that people need to review their databases by January. So what's the current status if that sort of IDIN process isn't available? What does KYC currently look like in the Netherlands?
Well, that's a very varied picture. It varies from requiring people to tick a box when they want to enter the game, stating that they are 18 years or older, to companies that have implemented IDIN today, and there's a great variety of solutions at the moment. The biggest problem and the hottest problem at this moment is how can they prevent underage from getting through to online gambling websites, and this really must be done the latest on the 1st of January. And as you say, the database will have to be purged by then of any underage player by that date.
So I guess one of the points there is your members, those operators, I think over 120 people, organisations have applied for an interest in a licence in the Netherlands. I guess at this point, because they can't access that, if they've got Dutch players, they're having to sort of go around and just decide amongst themselves or individually if they think that system is good enough, without any guidance, real guidance, I guess, from the regulator. Is that the case?
The regulator basically says, we don't care how you do it, but you have to be absolutely sure that no underage person is able to successfully register at the website and to put money in his account and play, and they will ask you to verify that you have made sure that this is impossible as of the 1st of January.
So I suspect, like all markets, the bigger companies maybe have a process that's already in place from elsewhere, but potential newer operators are going to have to look at the various different sources that are out. I think, James, from your perspective, you come at a sort of slightly different angle around. If we're concentrating on sort of KYC in general, you guys sort of lead with a slightly document first and facial aspect, sort of given that rounded potential solution out there. So tell us a bit about how you've seen that into the marketplaces, maybe where the gaming sector could learn a bit from that. Tell us a bit about away from the sort of CRA sources.
Yeah, of course. So like you say, so in I guess which like I say, we talked about the CRA underpinning verification. The approach typically, if you were to fail that, is to go around verifying people's identity documents. So it's commonly used at the moment still that verifying someone's form of legal identity is an approach to satisfy some KYC regulation you have when onboarding. Now, I think what's fascinating by this is if you turn it on its head and actually think, okay, rather than it just being a tick box exercise of asking for that document because the individual's got a thin file not being matched, or you're in a market which is hard to verify someone electronically, and think, what purpose does this document have? It's unbelievable. I mean, it's such a powerful source of truth to be able to do far more in having confidence of who the person is. It's far more about the identity of that individual. And one amazing component of an identity document is someone's biometrics. So if you start thinking about that, and there's a face on there, and how can you utilize this for knowing that person is who they say they are, you suddenly are able to very simply ask for a form of biometrics, maybe even a selfie in real time. And that completely satisfies or completely addresses not only some of the onboarding requirements, but also some of the big industry and relevant requirements about having confidence that person isn't impersonating someone else, or shouldn't be, or is of the right age to actually be able to go on and play on the site. Another really interesting part around this is how addressable it is when we think global, something you mentioned, Peter. As you touched on, like all of the guys on the panel have mentioned, everyone's a little bit same but a little bit different when it comes to different locations, whether it be because of regulatory requirements or actually what's capable within a country. So within the UK, CRA really great, but in France it's poor, and in Holland it's different, and even in a state, about a state by state basis, it's a little bit different. And what's fascinating about the use of documents and biometrics as a combination is it kind of simplifies stuff. It streamlines what you have as an internal KYC policy, and it gives you a far greater framework to be able for you to not have to train up experts on a country by country level and have lots and lots of different policies around how you verify someone here and there and there. So in terms of how you roll out and become, you utilize your digital footprint in a compliant way to avoid fines, but also in a seamless way. Having that structure, that standard, is seen to really good effect, and we've got some really good use cases around it.
Yeah, I think that the point of the slide I put up with it was really just to emphasize sort of the so many different parts on an identity. That old style, I was on a credit database or whatever, it was fine 10 years ago, but it was single, it was time stamped, it was there. I think the challenge is certainly in the UK, and then that's flooding elsewhere, is around adding things in like affordability and layering in different levels, because you need a rounded view of that customer. It's what they do and when they do it. So that system we've obviously used for quite a while now is showing the gaps that are there as we try to add in different layers of that. Trent, if I could come to you from a US perspective, because at the time I spent there a few years back, there was a really big concentration on geolocation, what you are, where you are as opposed to what you are. What's the view at the moment, and how are you seeing it? Because you touch base with all of the operators that are there. How do you see sort of KYC from a US perspective?
Yeah, I mean, going back on kind of what James and Peter-Paul had said, it's very similar in the US in that it originated as just, say, a tick box for are you 18? You can look at like the daily fantasy sports, which isn't as regulated as online sports betting. And a lot of that came as a result of federal laws, the Wire Act and the UIGEA, that have had an impact on what decisions are made. And the Wire Act specifically is what kind of drove the need for geolocation, as you're not allowed to take bets across state lines and then be in violation of that law. So the states individually have decided that they have to have this high level of geolocation. And for example, in the past, geolocation was really just IP address or the MAC address for digital device fingerprinting. And that has evolved greatly into the detection of the usage of VPNs or proxy software to hide your location or look like you're somewhere else to do so. And the regulations are strict in the sense that they need to make sure that the person is within the border, the approved region, to be able to be within compliance of those federal laws. However, that growth of the geolocation has opened up the opportunity to have a better expansive picture of KYC. KYC is more comprehensive than just age verification. It's really a holistic view of that player and that player's activity. So now that you can couple in true location, and we can restrict players who are trying to spoof and hide where they're from, adding that in with the document verification process and knowing that person A is from state A, and when they're attempting to place their bets, they're within that region, you're able to get a better picture overall, which allows you to have a more comprehensive risk-based approach of who that player is, where they're betting from, and how often they're betting, which then even leads into the ability to utilize that data in conjunction to determine problem gambling and the self-exclusion requirements that are out there, to ensure that a person who excludes themselves or is excluded for whatever reason in one region is not able to then play in other regions. Within the states, you have a lot of cities that are very close on the border. For example, New York and Hoboken area of New Jersey, or Philadelphia and then the Pennsylvania and then Cherry Hill of New Jersey. Those areas there are so close that it's not a lot for a person to travel across that border and then bet in another marketplace. So the technology's putting all of that information together with your age verification, KYC, location, and then even your playing patterns can help to create a more secure system across those borders and ensure that each state has controls in place that are monitoring the player's activity and ensuring that they're meeting all federal laws and state laws for those operators.
Yeah, I think it's. I think we all accept there's no single solution to all of this, and I think it's quite complex that what KYC actually means. But just to finish off this section, there's 2 points you made there. I'd like to quickly bring up with all of you around sort of problem gambling, and also then the self-exclusion systems that are out there. Because the UK version, GamStop, had hit the headlines with its own problems going back a couple of months, and that was all around the identity of the individual and the ability to change that. But in a country which does not have a centralized ID system, it's obviously pretty difficult. So from a problem gambling sort of self-exclusion, I'll stick with you for now, Trent, and then come back to Peter, Paul, and James. But from those two things, how are the US adapting to that? What are we seeing in place to address those?
Well, that's part of the problem within the US is that at a land-based casino perspective, there wasn't as much of a need to actually share information from state to state, because if a player self-excluded themselves from a live casino, they generally wouldn't take the effort to then drive 3 to 6 hours to a neighboring state and play. Obviously, there are people who probably did that, but it was a lot more difficult. But within the iGaming market and the mobile betting space, it's not as difficult to just cross a state border and be able to do so. So the regulators are starting to recognize the need for information sharing. And GamStop specifically is kind of a driver in that concept of having a centralized repository for self-exclusion and problem gambling so that it can control across borders what those users are able to do and not able to do once they're in that region. So at the current moment, each state has their own individualized self-exclusion responsible gaming program. But as I mentioned, the proliferation of mobile betting is spearheading the need for that data sharing. And they're looking at having the potential in the future of a centralized database that all operators would then have to run a check to ensure that those players aren't on that list.
Sorry, I was just going to. That's one of my fascinating points is that we're an industry that almost refuses to share data when financial services do, insurance companies do, whether it's a fraud that starts off the process. I particularly see self-exclusion as the starting point of our sector being forced down a route where it's going to have to share data because it's everybody else does, and it seems like the right thing to do. I think just from a Dutch perspective, Peter, Paul, is that sharing of data, or certainly from that self-exclusion scheme, is that something the Dutch are looking at as part of their regulations?
So currently there is no system yet to exclude yourself from gaming. There will be per the 1st of January 2021 when the new bill comes into force. The Central Register Exclusion Games of Chance, or CRUX as it's called in Dutch, which basically resembles the Swedish system Spelpaus. It seems like a pretty watertight system, and that system shares information in the central database on a national level. So.
I think you've highlighted there maybe the difference between the Dutch system and the UK. James, I know you spent sort of times looking at the UK version. From a KYC perspective, what's your thoughts on sort of self-exclusion and that whole problem gambling discussion?
So I think, I mean, self-exclusion is really being driven from not less so the industry and more so from consumers, isn't it? I mean, if you look at the sign-up rate for GamStop, which hasn't been widely marketed, it's unbelievable. Most businesses would love to have that level of sign-up acquisition. So it shows that there is a real, I guess, a real desire by customers to find a better way of doing it. The challenge ultimately is the industry itself. Like I say, this underpinning of how identity is done right now. There is no real barriers to access. it's very, very easy to gain access to any brand, and ultimately there's lots and lots of brands. So one ultimately good initiative outside of identity has been obviously the tightening of marketing. But now when the eyes are turned to identity itself, so the way in which you can accurately, so reduce the noise here when it comes to identity, there isn't really enough underpinning it. I mean, like you say, there's methods, whether it be email addresses, phone numbers, maybe ultimately the unique identifier seems to be an individual's address, but it's never unique enough to them. It's never their biometric or something which doesn't change. So all of these states are very easily changeable and very easily created. So unfortunately, we have an industry-wide problem at the moment whereby there isn't enough of a standard, which I kind of touched on previously, to allow the momentum, the long-term longevity of this requirement.
I was in a meeting, absolutely. I was in a meeting last week with the MGA and GamStop, and it was all around the lessons learned and what the challenges sort of the GB version had around doing that, and what the MGA is trying to achieve in their slightly more ambitious project. But you're right about sign-up rates, and it's just proven how important I think self-exclusion is. So look, I'm sort of conscious of time and on the topics and everything else. So let's just quickly dive into the last couple of two topics that we had. I wanted to look at innovation and how, from an identity perspective, what the industry's seeing and how we're doing that, or what the obstacles are as we're going along. So I think we'll go back through that with James from your perspective, and it probably covers a couple of points you've mentioned already. But sort of what are the developments from the innovation point of view? You're either working with clients both in the gaming and outside of it.
Yeah, I mean, innovation now ultimately is great because it removes the conflict and trade-off when it comes to adding greater, we talk about obstacles, but ultimately adding greater components to know your customer better, but without having to hindrance or create business impact, so losing good credible customers. So from a UX perspective, we're seeing lots of new IDV ways, so solutions without compromising on user experience. And we're now seeing businesses starting to use doc and biometric verification to power wider identity life cycles. So this could be everything from not only sign up, but to high value bets through to ultimately other risk signals, and being able to jumping in to make sure that person is who they say to be, that person at the beginning. So this is ultimately at high risk points. So ultimately it's about getting this right combination to be able to reduce, make it less frictionful, but also ultimately being able to, the innovation here is being able to automate far more controls internally. And just before we move on, it's kind of to touch on that point of, we know that many operators have lots and lots of staff dedicated to just doing due diligence on people. And when we say people, it's on a profile, which, and all you've got to go on is an email address, like I say, and potentially their mobile device, and that's it. And they're having to do all sorts of research to see who that person is. It sounds extremely counterintuitive when there's lots more innovation that can be done.
I think you're right. I think automation's the key part of that, and that's a challenge, I guess, for someone like you guys, is how the operators, if you like, want less suppliers, not more, that streamline of that process. So I would suspect the more a solution could potentially add into that is the better. I'm going to come back to that because I've had a question in a second, but we'll go to Trent and then Peter-Paul. Trent, on an innovation front, what are we seeing in the US? You say they're just sort of dragging themselves into the sort of mobile world. What's the latest from in the US?
Well, yeah, just as James had mentioned, that a lot of the companies through the past have spent an exorbitant amount of dollars in manual processing of documents and things of this nature. And that has made it very cost prohibitive to do the right thing, as you said earlier, which just seems to make sense. Knowing who your customer is when they sign up and having all those data points that can give you that confidence of such are available now. And with the proliferation of mobile devices and the various sensors that can be used within the device, for example, for location specifically, you have a much higher confidence of who that person is and where they're at when you can utilize say, for example, a system like Onfido, where you're doing biometric matching with their government-issued ID. And those are the innovations of the future within the United States. As that becomes more trusted by the regulators, they will push that to the operators. And ultimately, I think it's best for the operators to utilize that automation process and to be able to improve their ability to process that request without those overly cumbersome costs of manual validation for the users. So putting all those data points together, automating it, that is what the future of innovation is going to be. And I think that holds true in all markets, not just in the United States.
Yes, great. Thanks for that. So, Peter-Paul, from a Dutch perspective, and your members and the operators that are looking to enter that market, are they seeing a smooth path to innovation? Are they seeing any blockers on the way? What's the view from Holland?
I largely agree with what Trent just said and James said. The biggest roadblocks at the moment are timeliness. So how quickly can solutions be implemented into their online offerings? This has to be, or at least the age verification at registration has to be ready by the 1st of January. So this is a major concern, I would say. And after that, things will turn stricter very quickly. The Netherlands will be, so operators operating in the Netherlands will be expected to be up to speed on KYC, and the requirements are going to be, be very strict.
I think, back to my earlier comment, I think if you're one of the big players with a big compliance department, then you've got more of a chance of hitting those deadlines and doing that. That sometimes inhibits your chance to innovate. But the smaller operators that are looking to that, they may well have a real issue on getting their systems. That system, I guess, got to be in place for January, but the license is not for an 18 months. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Right. Okay, just quickly, the last point last point on this, because everybody sort of looks at AI, and we've talked about biometrics and voice. What do we see sort of that next iteration? Is there something coming along in the next sort of 12 months around what is viable use? How far are we from going, Alexa, Siri, who's going to win the game at next Thursday? So what do we think is the next? James, I'll come to you first. What do we think sort of the next iteration of innovation in tech in the industry?
Hi there. Yeah, so I think to not get too far ahead, all of these components at the moment work very well, but typically in silo. So I think the big area, and we talk about that need for automation, is augmenting all of these together. Right now, like I say, there's no AI being used for many businesses, and they're just using documents very much on their own by manually verifying things. So what we will anticipate seeing is more of an orchestrated platform with all of these signals really feeding into ultimately more of an internal mothership, being able to make very instant, accurate, data-driven decisions without the need of huge amounts of humans. So that's what I see on the back end. On the front end, ultimately, consumers now are looking at any mobile journey as one. So whether it be accessing a car through an app like Uber or something like that, through to buying something, through to opening a bank account, through to having a bet. So really, it's mobile. All of these businesses in mobile are looking at one another about how easy it is and how interoperable they are when it comes to the next big change, I see.
Okay, just rather than come back, I've got a few questions coming, so let's try and work the way through the first couple, and then we'll see what time we've got left. But given the first question is, given that the regulator is imposing stricter rules on identification, how do we as operators assure we are deploying the right, most trusted vendors? So whether it be credit rating agencies or services like yourselves. Trent, I'll come to US perspective, and then Peter, Paul, and then James. So how if you're an operator and you've got this wealth of new products out there, as well as the sort of old style CRA stuff, how do you work out which are the right ones to use?
Within the US market, it's, I believe, going to be a little bit simpler because in each individual state, the providers of these technologies are going to have to be required to be licensed. they will have to go through a vetting process by the regulators to determine the suitability of that product. Once they're vetted and approved by that regulator, then the operators are able to know who they can work with and who meets the requirements of such regulations. So that makes it a little bit simpler. Within the UK and other markets, I think that's maybe lagging slightly behind, but it is becoming more prevalent that they need to monitor the vendors that provide these various solutions. And I think that's really where we need to be as far as an industry, is rely on what the regulations do for us, and that is ultimately doing the right thing. If the operators are doing the right thing, then they'll meet their compliance needs.
I think that's it. I stumbled straight into that one. Of course, the answer is you've got regulation out there for suppliers. Just get one of those licenses. Peter-Paul, from a Dutch perspective, do you see that being a sort of viable way forward? Because certainly the UK has never done that.
Yeah, I wish we had a licensing system like they do in the States. We don't have it in the Netherlands. Basically, it's a process of standardization, which takes a lot of time, and the possibility for accidents is big during that process. It would have been great if there would have been some sort of audit, or you could get it rubber stamped with the government, stating that this is a good solution to implement. But we're not there.
Yeah, no, and I guess that's just another level of complexity from the regulators' point of view. Although, as Trent pointed out, they obviously do that in the US. James, from your perspective, obviously providers aren't licensed, if you like, in the UK, and most of the other ones are, apart from the US, might be light touch. What's your view on, from your perspective, from a supplier and licensing?
It's difficult. I completely agree with Peter-Paul. It's a shame that there isn't some standards, and if anything, like you say, the regulator is relaxing some of their approaches in terms of offering more freedom around this risk-based approach element for businesses. I think what really helps operators potentially is to kind of really establish what flow they're looking to create. At the moment, there's a very default journey. And if they are looking to kind of change that, kind of we've heavily emphasized the use here of potentially documents and facial recognition being used at the point of engagement, so new to brand customers. It's kind of looking at that as that's the way you want to try it, or you want to test it out, and then looking at which providers in the space carry that type of method. Okay. And it's worth obviously going to source initially, to get a good grounding of what's there.
I guess the point being that if there's no strict licensing for providers or vendors, then it's a case of properly tried and trusting them, looking into the background, making sure the business is compliant, never mind the process, and then just testing them out and working with the regulators on that. I think that's the sort of middle ground on that. I quickly want to skip through a couple of questions that are on there. So how will the regulator be able to streamline competitors to safeguard players that can currently slip through the cracks that less compliant operators? So I guess that's an operator saying, how do we get rid of the bad guys? Peter-Paul, from a Dutch perspective, is the Dutch regulator addressing that?
Not that I can see. No, I don't see that happening at current. But what would be a solution is for the industry to get together, very much like the online gambling companies did in the Netherlands in the trade association, and make it a form of self-regulation, keeping the bad players out.
Yeah, okay. Well, look, I think we're running short of time, so I'll quickly skip on to the last point, and we'll see if we can get another question in while we're going there. So I think the last point...
Oh, sorry, just on that very last one. It's worth touching in mind that operators have quite a good opportunity whereby they have a lot of customers on mobile and a lot of customers on web, and they are very much two very different channels when it comes to engaging with a customer. So when they think about what risk exposure, what impact could it have, it's like maybe taking one of those journeys in isolation and really maybe trying to get the fraud lower or the fraud lower or the improvements on a certain journey, and then looking how they can replicate it in another environment, rather than taking it too big a pie, looking at smaller bite sizes, and that ultimately will start washing out the fraudsters over time and get a better standard in the industry.
Absolutely fair point. Okay, all right, let's finish up with a quick minute or so on the consumer. So everybody talks about the regulator driving change. For me, the old processes, the friction in the way simply won't be put up with by that next generation coming through. So whether that's generation Y, Z, whatever it might be, they're used to a much more streamlined journey. So I guess we've got a battle between friction and UX, GDPR, AML, and AML. So what's the view of the panel, very briefly, just in a few seconds, of what the consumer wants and what they're going to be expecting over the next couple of years? Trent, we'll come to you first.
Yeah, I think from a consumer perspective, they want the easiest process to sign up to multiple sites. And right now, it doesn't matter which site you sign up to, you're going to have to then do that same process with that additional operator. So I think that customers are really wanting to be able to verify themselves once and then be able to utilize the various brands that are out there. And I do believe that doing the right thing and sharing that data information is what the industry should be looking at. Regulation shouldn't really be viewed as something that's a hindrance. When you take the perspective of just doing the bare minimum to get by the regulation, you're actually going to create more hassles and headaches for yourself as an operator. Doing the right thing by your consumer, your customer, is ultimately going to be the payoff in the long run.
Okay, yeah, fair point. Peter-Paul, from your perspective, a Dutch consumer any different from anybody else?
No, I'm afraid not. I think the consumers want something that is easy to use, not overly cumbersome, and at the same time, absolutely safe. And you want to make sure that no information is shared with the operator or anybody else. And on the point of the regulations, the regulation should be principle-based instead of rule-based. And I'm afraid currently in the Netherlands, the regulations are rule-based and are very, very prescriptive, which is kind of it's a trap that you're running into and can't get out easily because there's no way you can regulate future developments. So it's always a catch-up game, really.
Yep. Absolutely. Last point to you, James, before we go. What's your view on what you're seeing from consumer-led intel?
Yeah, so I mean, customers want to feel protected, and I think easy is really important, obviously, at sign up. But I think what's important is consumers care more about, well, actually, consumer responsibility is more at a secondary point, and additional engagement, because ultimately gambling is something you do very regularly, and consumers' behaviours and consumers' appetite to doing things change. So I think what's really important is consumers are becoming a little bit more savvy now about how protected are they. And if it is easy, it should be easy, but not as easy as it is today for some people, or actually sometimes very difficult. So really what I'm saying is actually about how consumers are wanting to see a different ongoing relationship with their brands, with the people they bet with, and that ultimately requires greater protection.
All right, yeah, good stuff. Okay, look, I think there's a couple of questions we're not going to have time on. I've got 7 or 8 here. That what I will do is get the guys at AGR to respond on those because we're running out of time. But a couple of really interesting questions around the sharing of data and low-level spend, what you do with people that are on there and whether you shut them off, how we will automated 3D biometrics, and then how we engage with customers when they've got very low level of online footprint. But I'm conscious of time. We have run out of our hour-long segment. I would like to thank everybody involved. I will hand back to Niamh, but just to say the questions we will come in, we will follow up on. We'll get everybody to see them. And thanks for taking your time out of your day to listen.